Have you ever heard one sentence so small it sounded like nothing, and then watched it rearrange an entire life? It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, in a neighborhood market where the ceiling fans made a slow, tired wind and the fluorescent lights hummed like a machine that had seen too many mornings. Marcelo was there because he had a habit of being in the wrong places at the right time. Habit, not need. He kept his life tidy. A spacious apartment with a view that stopped most conversations. A car that eased scuffs out of traffic. A calendar booked with meetings that never filled the silence in his home. People called him successful. He knew better. Success had a look, matching cufflinks, a pristine desk, but it had no voice, and that quiet used to keep him up at night. He wasn't a man who shopped for groceries. He would hire someone to do that. But today, feeling restless, he walked aisles he could have closed his eyes through. It was a small rebellion against the predictability of his days. He reached for a bar of soap, lingered over the jam section, and then moved toward the registers because there's a certain comfort in endings. One item scanned, a beep, a receipt folded, continuity restored. That's when he noticed them. A woman with tired hands counting coins on the edge of a plastic shopping basket, and a little boy sitting sideways on the cart, legs too short to touch the bottom. The boy's hair was cut unevenly, the kind of job you do yourself on a Sunday, when there's no one to take the other hand for you. He watched the child stack the last of a small, mismatched set of toy cars on the basket's metal lip, and for a moment, the market noise dwindled to the thin clink of coins. Simone did not look like the people who had the right to be pitied. She looked like someone who refused it. Her jaw had the kind of strength that didn't announce itself. When the cashier told her the total, her fingers found the coins like they were a puzzle to be solved. She counted carefully, eyes steady on the little pile, and then she made a sound that was equal parts determination and apology. "How much am I missing?" she asked quietly, as though asking for the time. A pause. The cashier said the number, and the boy looked up. Marcelo saw the way the mother's fingers trembled just enough to betray her concentration. Then, with a voice low and framed in resolve, she said to the cashier, and to the hushed handful of people now aware, "I will pay you when I can." It was not a plea. It was a promise. Something in Marcelo's chest tightened. It wasn't charity in its theatrical form, not the discreet donation that removes discomfort. It was honesty laid out like an open palm. He felt suddenly the ridiculousness of his own wealth, as if it were a dress he'd been wearing too long, as if the seams were beginning to itch. He stepped forward. "I'll cover that," he said, and his voice sounded unlike the one he used in boardrooms. It was smaller. It was human. Simone looked at him with the same steady dignity she had for the coins. For a moment she said nothing, because words can be clumsy in the face of grace. She accepted the payment as if it were a practical thing, a transaction, and her eyes did not plead. She handed him the tissue of a receipt the way someone hands over a small, sensible belonging. "Thank you," she said, crisp and sincere. He could have left it at that. He had, after all, many things to attend to, meetings, appointments, the invisible apparatus of his life that believed it must be constantly fueled. But the child in the cart reached out and adjusted one of the toy cars so it sat straight. Marcelo noticed the way the boy hummed to himself, an absent-minded tune that made Marcelo remember that there are rhythms in people that money cannot buy. "I can give you a ride home," Marcelo offered before he knew why he was saying it. Simone tilted her head. There was no softness in curiosity, just an evaluation of the offer. "I don't want to be a bother," she said, and the phrase snapped like a thread between them, thin, taut, human. "You won't be," he replied. "Ooh." On the short drive, the city shifted around them like scenery. Marcelo watched the buildings change from clean glass facades to painted houses with laundry lines that embroidered the air. The rearview mirror framed the child with his small chin tucked to watch the passing streets, and Marcelo found himself unnamed on the inside, a watcher who wanted to keep watching. Simone talked in short sentences that carried more meaning than they seemed to. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning in the mornings, folding shirts and translating receipts into fares in the evenings. She liked her coffee black and strong enough to hold a conversation. She had a son, Gustavo, who had been sick last week but was fine now. She said was with the same care she used for the coins. It could have been a fact or a guarded confession. When Marcelo tried to pay attention to how she spoke about the city, about the way she repaired small things at home, he realized how unschooled the head he'd been living with his whole life was at noticing the ordinary glue people use to hold a life together. Simone's speech was economy and affection braided together. Her dignity was not the absence of need, but the deliberate refusal to let need dissolve her. Before he left, she reached for his hand as if returning a borrowed item. "I should give this back," she said, and she handed him a card. Her number written with a pen that pressed hard into the paper, like a promise stamped into cloth. "Keep it," he said, and then, because manners are stubborn, he added, "Call me if you ever need a ride." She hesitated, then smiled a small, contained smile that reached her eyes. "When I can," she said, with a little laugh that had no edges. "I will pay you when I can." That sentence lodged in his mind like a line of music. He went home with the echo of it folding neatly into the apartment's silence. I say all this not to make Marcelo a saint from the start. He was too human, too bruised for that. But because the simplest thing he could offer that day was attention. He had money enough. He had, perhaps more rarely, the capacity to let himself be touched. For someone like him, who had learned to compartmentalize life into appointments and tasks, watching a mother count coins was a window into a part of the world he had been trained to be absent from. That first night, he sat with a glass of wine that tasted of oak and something else he couldn't name, and he thought about Renata. He had been married once. Married to a woman who had grown tired of trying to love what had been broken by both of them. In the quiet, and with brutal efficiency, she'd taken the photograph albums and the hope of a child out of the house. There had been a medical diagnosis, some scientific phrase that had the tenderness of a locked door. Marcelo had learned the hard way that you can find out you will not be a biological father and still have the parts of you that define fatherhood waiting in the room with the empty crib. He told himself he had moved past it, rationalized it into projects and trips, but the truth is that emptiness had a way of settling into the everyday, like dust into corners you stopped noticing existed. He liked to tell himself that solitude was a choice. Simone's words proved it wasn't always that simple. 2 days later he called. He told himself it would be a kind thing to check whether she made it home without trouble. He dialed the number and let it ring until her voice answered. And when she did, the voice that came down the line was present and unembellished. "Hi," she said. "It's me." They arranged to meet at a small lanchonette on the corner of a street lined with jacaranda trees, Dona Noisa's place, a room that smelled of coffee, warm bread, and the kind of oil that has seen hundreds of hands. He told his driver he'd be walking. He wanted the anonymity of feet on pavement, the small ritual of stepping into a neighborhood rather than gliding in a car that never left a footprint. Dona Noisa caught his eye as soon as he stepped inside. She was the kind of woman whose faces mapped in curves learned from laughter. When Simone arrived with Gustavo clutching a small fabric dinosaur, the two women greeted each other with a familiarity that suggested years, not days. Marcelo watched as Simone slid the change into her small purse. The gesture was purposeful, not embarrassed. She counted the coins out again, as she did when she had to make a decision, and offered them back. "I should return this," she insisted. "You don't owe me anything," Marcelo said. She looked at him directly. "I said I would pay you when I could," she replied. The sentence held weight. It was a principle, not a request to be dismissed. He left a tip on the table and told her softly, "Let the world keep a few debts." They spoke for a long time about small things, about how the boy preferred the company of pigeons at the park rather than other children, because they never wanted anything from him, about the colors Gustavo preferred in his drawings, about how Simone had been raised by a mother who taught her the stubborn art of repair. Marcelo lied less than you might expect about himself. He didn't talk about money. He let truths like his divorce sit in small, rounded phrases that were true, but not exhausting. Simone did not ask why he was alone. She assumed kindly that everyone carried something. It was on a late afternoon bench that the real changes started. Not dramatic, not cinematic in the way a film spins a revelation, but subtle like the way salt brings out flavor in a dish. They went to the park because it was where Gustavo felt free enough to run. Marcelo paid for the small tickets for the carousel, for the packet of seeds the boy would scatter to the pigeons. Each small transaction was an exchange of dignity. Marcelo refused fanfare. He asked for Gustavo's hand when the boy hesitated, not because he wanted to own him, but because he wanted to be invited into the small rituals of care. There were mornings Marcelo would find that he had come to expect a message from Simone, photos of drawings, a note about a school assignment, the curious little details of a day in which survival and joy are braided tightly. He began in the way people do when they are startled by a feeling that had been sitting at the edge of their awareness, to make space around those messages. He cleared slots in his calendar that used to be filled with lunches with men who spoke in market percentages. He learned the layout of Gustavo's small house, where the crooked toys were stored, the cupboard that never quite closed right, the window seat that collected dust. He learned slowly how presence can be a gift that costs nothing and everything at once. None of this was grand. There were no dramatic purchases intended to fix anyone. He did not, as people with money sometimes do to salve conscience, buy up solutions. Instead, his gestures were quiet. A replacement school backpack when the old one split, a small medicine cabinet stocked for unexpected fevers, a winter coat that fit him like a promise. Simone accepted these things the way she had accepted his first payment, without theatrical gratitude, with the calm of someone who measures worth by the steadiness of gestures, not by their shine. And then there was the after-work quietness that began to change the apartment he had kept immaculate for one. Gustavo, who had once been a presence that happened outside the apartment, started to appear inside it. He would sit on the sofa, with his small feet curled beneath him, and Marcelo would catch himself watching the subtleties of a child's face. How his brow creased when he concentrated. How his hand would find Marcelo's and hold it as a small compass. Marcelo had nightmares at first. He would wake at 3 a.m. and find himself staring at the photograph of a life that could have been, holidays hollowed by absence, birthdays observed with mechanical politeness, toys arranged on a shelf that only gathered dust. In the day those images softened. The present made new images. The sound of Gustavo's small voice calling him uncle the first few times because the word father had edges both complicated and tender. The way Simone would grin at a private joke the two of them shared about the pigeons at the park. In his private moments, Marcelo wrestled with what this meant. He had the means to provide materially, but the deeper, more frightening possibility was that his heart was making room for something it had been trained to avoid. There was fear. Fear that he might be performing kindness to fill his own loneliness. Fear that by opening, he might feel the sting of loss sharpen again if things didn't work out. But then he'd find at breakfast a small drawing of a dinosaur taped to the fridge and feel a fierce joy he hadn't named before. Simone remained herself, proud, fierce in a quiet way, wary of becoming defined by the kindness she received. She did not let the gifts change the way she moved in the world. She kept her jobs, she negotiated the bus fares and the shifts, she paid back what she could when she could. She taught Gustavo to set aside a coin each week, and he would march over to the little jar in their kitchen with an air of ceremony that made Marcelo smile at the ritual's dignified smallness. There was a particular afternoon where the ordinary seemed to fold into something larger. They had been to the zoo, the day warm and slightly sticky, full of the smell of fried snacks and the faint tang of animal enclosures. Marcelo had watched Gustavo press his face against the glass of a small enclosure where tamarin monkeys swarmed like a whirl of tiny brown leaves. The boy's fascination was absolute. For a moment Marcelo saw himself in him, not in biology, but in the way both practiced a quiet attention to the world. On the walk home, under a sky that carried the heat of the day like a soft thing, Simone mentioned without drama that Gustavo had been ill a few weeks before. He had a cough that wouldn't quit. They had taken him to a clinic. They'd been told to be watchful. He was better, she said, but things flare. Kids are like that. She said it as one might say a small truth, something managed and contained. As Marcelo listened, a thin, unexpected tenderness moved through him. It wasn't a plan. It was a feeling that arrived like someone moving the furniture in a room so that a new light could come through. He realized with a sudden clarity that made his stomach tighten pleasantly that fatherhood might not be a binary condition assigned at birth, but a practice, an assiduous presence offered day after day. He began to think about what it would mean to be responsible not just for a bill paid, but for the slow work of being known. He thought about patience, about the long stretches of unremarkable care that stitched together a family. He found that the idea of attending doctor's appointments, of waiting through fevered nights, no longer felt like an imposition, but a place where he might belong. Weeks folded into months. The city changed with them, seasons shifting the angle of golden light over tiled roofs. Marcelo's routine adjusted almost imperceptibly. Instead of leaving for meetings straight from the apartment, he would take a moment to sit at the kitchen table with Gustavo, while the boy sipped his cocoa. The small sweetness of the beverage bonding them in a domestic ritual Marcelo hadn't known he wanted. People began to notice. Friends of Marcelo commented on a new softness to his face, a loosening of the lines that had been carved by solitude. Simone's co-workers observed how she held herself a little lighter, how she had begun to laugh in a way that wasn't practical but free. None of them dramatized the change. It settled in the ordinary, the way water finds its level, uncelebrated but steady, yet life kept its edges. Past hurts did not vanish because a child felt safe in his lap. Renata's presence lingered like an unfinished sentence in Marcelo's mind. There were evenings when he would sit with the thought of what had once been, and wonder if he was stepping into a mirage of repair. He spoke about these things rarely, and when he did, it was to a friend who listened, and then simply said, "Being afraid means you care." Fear, then, as proof of feeling rather than a sign of weakness. The promise Simone had made in the supermarket, "I will pay you when I can," kept returning to Marcelo in moments of quiet. It was a line that had held more than debt. It had been a compact of dignity, a refusal to be diminished by circumstance. It marked in his mind the moment where two lives brushed and decided to press closer. Each small repayment Simone made, an offer to take care of a meal now and then, a bag of rice she insisted on buying, was an act of agency. She was not a passive recipient. She was a participant in a slowly forming contract of mutual respect. Then one night, the ordinary cracked. The phone call came after midnight, the kind of ring that pierces sleep because the world has rules and the phone knows when to bend them. Marcelo heard the voice on the line before he was fully awake, a voice that carried urgency without hysteria. "Marcelo, it's Gustavo. He's burning up. He's coughing and won't breathe right." Simone's voice was taut, the tone of someone who had been steady for so long and now felt the chords of composure fray. She was precise in her instructions, what he'd been given, when, what to bring. She sounded scared. That sound erased whatever confidence Marcelo had in the furtive stockpiles of quiet he had built. His muscles remembered the reflexes of preparedness. He dressed without thinking, his feet finding clothes in the dark with a familiarity that made him question why he had been absent, why he had let worry be something that flew over him like a distant weather system. The drive to their small apartment was a breathless blur. The city at night is a different creature, neon signs smeared into streaks, the air sharper, the sounds of street vendors and taxis mended into one urgent rhythm. Marcelo sped not because traffic allowed it, but because the idea of delay felt obscene. He found himself thinking in fragments, the original supermarket promise, Gustavo's humming tune, small hands reaching for cookie crumbs. When he arrived, the apartment smelled of eucalyptus and steam. Gustavo was a small figure in the sink of a ragged couch, a blanket pulled up to his chin, and his breath coming in quick, thin pulls. Simone was on her knees by the bed, one hand pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. The other braced against the cushion, as if anchoring herself to the world. "Take him to the hospital," the paramedic said when they had a brief exchange in the hallway, the practical brevity of someone used to emergencies. Marcelo moved as if muscle memory had been wired into him, the way one learns to reach for a falling glass. He scooped Gustavo into his arms and felt the boy's small body as if he were an urgent truth. The muffled beeping of a distant traffic light merged with the sound of his own heart. In the taxi on the way to the hospital, the driver took a route Marcelo had never known. He sat with his hand on Gustavo's back, feeling the thin rise and fall, and thought about everything he had done so far. He thought about promises, his own and those given to him. He thought about dignity and the way Simone had never let herself be defined by what she lacked. He thought about love that is not measured by blood, but by fidelity to small repeated acts. At the hospital doors, lights were too bright and too honest. People who worked there moved with the steady precision of professionals who meet fear daily and continue. Nurses guided them into triage and asked the right questions in the right tone. A doctor with tired eyes but steady hands looked at Gustavo and said words that were clinical, but kind. They checked lungs, listened to breath sounds with cold instruments that somehow felt warm from human hands. They spoke of monitoring and support and antibiotics, and they did it with the authority Marcelo both found relieving and frightening. Simone sat beside the bed, fingers braided in her lap, the part of her that had been so composed in the market now raw. Marcelo set his hand on hers. No pronouncements, just the simple pressure that said he was there. For a person who had known how to put a price on many things, he felt suddenly incapable of assigning worth to these small minutes. As they waited for the tests, the hospital's fluorescent light turned the color of the room into something clinical and unromantic. Gustavo's breathing steadied slightly, then faltered, then steadied again. A nurse adjusted the oxygen slightly, and the boy's chest rose in a less labored, though still ailing rhythm. The night stretched long and delicate, threaded with the sound of distant machines and the low murmur of hushed conversations. It was in those hours, as they watched over the child together, that Marcelo realized how fully he had stepped into something he had not planned for. The money he had spent on groceries on a whim had been the entrance, but now he saw that what mattered was the sleepless nights by a child's bedside, the appointments, the whispered reassurances. This was not a purchase he could make and be done with. It was a commitment he might have to live, breathe, and return to every day. When the nurse brought the preliminary bill, an administrative step designed to keep the hospital functioning, Simone's eyes flicked to Marcelo. There was no shame in the glance, only an acknowledgement. Here was where dignity and logistics collided. Marcelo reached for his wallet with a calm he didn't feel. He paid the bill, not because he wanted control over the situation, but because in that sterile room the currency of care had a clear and immediate requirement. Simone watched him, and in the look he found neither gratitude that sought to diminish, nor indebtedness that demanded repayment. It was a look of something mutual and raw, Two people facing an unknown together, their pasts folded back into straps that held them steady. Gustavo coughed softly and, with a child's indifference to meanings adults assign, reached for Marcelo's finger. Marcelo took it, feeling small, colossal, and utterly present all at once. They sat in that vigil as the monitor's rhythm marked the night. Marcelo thought of the promise in the market, of the pride Simone had held like armor, of the way her voice had carried both truth and dignity when she had said, "I will pay you when I can." He now understood how such a line could change a life. It was not the promise of repayment that mattered, but the promise of integrity it represented, the kind of integrity that invites others to trust. Outside, dawn was a rumor on the horizon. Inside the room, the city slept or moved in ways adults rarely notice. Marcelo realized that there were possibilities now that hadn't been there when he answered a different kind of call. He had money, yes, and he had comfort. But he was discovering that what unsettled him, in the best possible way, was the burgeoning depth of care he felt. The phone on the bedside table chimed. A new nurse changed the chart. The doctor came and left with calm updates. The night had not reached a resolution, but the tide had shifted. Marcelo, who used to slice his life into tidy compartments, watched as this 1 hour unraveled into the rest of his days. He had arrived to cover a grocery bill. He found himself hours later covering an infant's hospital costs. He had not come to be a father. He had found that in order to be present, he might have to be willing to be transformed. The thought was both terrifying and absolute, like stepping off a ledge onto a net that felt at once secure and unfamiliar. When you stand at the threshold of something that asks more of you than you thought possible, you realize that promises have a gravity. Simone's promise in the supermarket had been small, but promises can attract. They find people who are willing to be changed. They rearrange what we consider possible. And as the morning light eased into the room, Marcelo made a decision that felt less like heroism and more like an alignment. He would stay. He would sit through the tests. He would listen to the medical updates. He would be a presence that was not performative, not loud, not meant to be a story told at parties. It would be the daily, ordinary work of care. He tightened his grip on Gustavo's small hand, and for the first time in a long spell, welcomed the idea that his life could be redeemed not by a grand gesture, but by the slow accumulation of 1,000 small ones. The day outside the hospital windows was beginning to commit itself to being real when Simone whispered, exhausted but steady, "I will pay you when I can," as if reaffirming the line that had started this. Marcelo squeezed her hand back and answered without thinking, "You never had to." Her smile that followed was brief but honest, the kind of smile that acknowledges pain and chooses nonetheless to step forward. They were not finished with fear. They were not finished with tests or with paperwork or with the way life insists on being complicated. But there was a new fact. They would face it together. A nurse returned with results, and the doctor stepped into the doorway with measured steps, the kind that make or break a night's worth of waiting. The words she chose next would determine the form that the crisis would take. Nothing theatrical, only medical reality, moving in the cadence of diagnosis and treatment. Marcelo braced himself for what would come. For the appointments, the bills, the long phone calls to specialists, the quiet nights filled with fear. He looked at Gustavo, half asleep, and understood finally that love is not an escape from fragility, but an embrace of it. He would not shy away. And with the first thin light of morning slicing across the linoleum floor, they waited for the doctor to speak. The doctor cleared her throat, then sat on the edge of the plastic chair, as if the furniture could take some of the weight for her. She had the look of someone who has learned how to deliver urgent news without letting it become a drama. Her voice was steady, the soft pragmatism of a person trained to translate fear into plan. "Gustavo has a severe respiratory infection," she said. We're seeing significant inflammation in his lungs. We're going to start IV antibiotics and oxygen support. We'll monitor him closely through the night and repeat some tests in the morning. Right now, the priority is to stabilize his breathing and keep him comfortable. Words like severe always carry a double life. They are precise in the mouth of someone who knows what they mean, and they are enormous in the ears of those who don't. Simone's face was an immediate map of the attention she gave to each syllable. Marcelo felt the old, tiny ribs of panic lift in his throat, then set themselves like a new posture. Action. Will he be okay? Simone asked, voice thin but not overwhelmed. The question was factual, like a person handing over a tool and asking whether it would work. The doctor looked at Gustavo's small form, then back at them. We expect improvement with the treatment. He may need a couple of days of observation. There's a good chance he will recover fully, but we need to be cautious and attentive. It was the kind of careful hope that invited work. Marcelo nodded as if the room had asked him to do something simple and clear. Be present. The idea of presence, that accumulation of small things he had been practicing, felt now like the literal task ahead. He did not have to solve everything at once, he only had to refuse to leave. A hospital administrator arrived with forms and another layer of language, insurance codes, deposit amounts, payment options. Simone's eyes flicked to Marcelo and then away, the movement a reflex of a woman who had learned to carry embarrassment like a loose sleeve. You don't have to, she began. I can, Marcelo said. There was no grand flourish, no public announcement. He simply reached to sign the boxes that would let the doctors do their job without delay. It was not a purchase of gratitude. In his head, the earlier act, paying in the market, resolved into a line of integrity that now connected to this moment. The money was a tool to remove obstacles so care could happen unimpeded. It was practical as a bandage. Simone stayed by Gustavo's bed like a magnet anchored to the small body of her son. She did not leave when nurses moved around them or when the IV was gently taped into the child's arm. She held his hand and murmured things that sounded like both lullaby and checklist. Drink, breathe, rest, you're strong. Words that worked as both command and prayer. Marcelo, who had been trained to schedule his life in neat blocks, discovered the odd softness of time in a hospital night. Minutes stretched, then snapped. He watched the monitors with a strange, alien patience, listening to beeps that used to mean something in corporate edifices, but now spelled out the fragile arithmetic of a child's recovery. He read the doctor's clipped notes and learned the names of medications that sounded like distant foreign cities. He accepted each explanation without pretending to have understood more than the essentials. He sat, and he held a chair, and when Gustavo's small fingers curled around his thumb, the gesture felt like a covenant, much larger than the formalities that had summoned them to this fluorescent room. At some point between the oxygen adjustment and the nurse's check, Simone fell asleep in a chair that offered no comfort, posture slumped and face soft for the first time since Marcelo had known her. The exhaustion of a mother who bears responsibility all day finally came down in a measured surrender. Marcelo watched her and felt the familiar rise of something he was learning to name. Protective, yes, but also tender, in that particular way that is not ownership, but commitment. When the night dragged a little longer than the two of them had hoped, Marcelo walked the hospital corridor. Fluorescent lights, vending machines humming like uncertain companions. The occasional murmur of other families becoming the background of a place where people came to exchange fear for the chance of care. He found himself near a window that overlooked the street below, where early morning traffic was only a rumor, and he leaned his forehead against the cool glass. He thought of Renata in a way that no longer felt like accusation, but like a closed book he had opened too often. He thought of promises, of the small one in the supermarket and the quiet, accumulating commitments that had followed it. A nurse came out, smiling at him in that kind, slightly apologetic way people who do emotionally hard work learn. "It's improving," she said. "The antibiotics are doing what they should. He'll need at least 48 hours of observation, probably with some more oxygen, but the trend is good." The word improving rearranged the space in his chest. It was not a victory, but it was not defeat either. It was the middle ground where care works. By the second day, tests suggested Gustavo's lungs were responding. The fever fell in increments. The IV remained, but the oxygen requirement dropped. The doctor came in with charts and a readable smile. "He's moving in the right direction. If he continues like this, we can think about discharge within the next day or two," she said. "Healers deal with grief and deliver hope in equal measures." Marcelo found himself grateful in a way that tasted less like relief and more like the slow settling of a new habit. The practicalities returned: invoices to sign, a discharge plan to coordinate, questions about follow-up appointments. When the final bill was presented, a number that could be a household savings in Simone's world, she looked at it as if reading an unfamiliar language. Her fingers moved automatically to a phrase she'd practiced at the market. "I will pay you when I can." He stopped her with a look that had no theatre. "You don't have to," he said. She looked at him, then at the paper, then at him again. "I will," she replied. The sentence had a quality of ritual now, not out of obligation but as a contract with herself, a way to keep agency in the midst of being supported. It mattered to her, and that mattered to him. "You don't owe me anything like that," he said. "You've already returned more than you know. Let me take care of this." There are gestures that feel like a closure of a loop. Paying the bill for the hospital was one such moment. Not the purchase of gratitude, but the practical wiping of an obstacle so that life could continue. Simone accepted that, and she did it in a way that preserved her dignity. She asked about the paperwork for outpatient care, about the names of doctors who could see Gustavo if anything flared again. She never once presented herself as mere recipient. There was agency in every question. They left the hospital in the grey light of midday, Gustavo quieter but awake, his small hand tucked in Marcelo's. The city was the same as the one that had watched them arrive, but for the trio in the car, everything felt as if it had been reordered. The promise that had been spoken months ago in a grocery line, "I will pay you when I can," resonated now not as a ledger entry, but as a moral pulse that had drawn two lives closer. After the hospital visit, they went home to the small apartment they had built together in the months since that first grocery aisle. Partly out of circumstance, partly because proximity is the currency of care. The first weeks after discharge were stitched with normalities that looked like love. Fever checks at 2 a.m, a parade of small breads in the morning light, a neighbor who brought soup, a teacher who accepted a hesitant note and smiled. Marcelo learned to refill the kitchen's medicine cabinet, to read the labels carefully, to sit quietly when Simone needed to talk through scheduling work shifts. They fell into a kind of domestic choreography that had an old look to it, things done without fanfare but with an attention that made them sacred. Marcelo also noted the ways his own life rearranged to make room. Business lunches, previously a measure of status and obligation, became negotiable. He turned down travel that would keep him away at nights. He found the quieter rewards of a different economy. A small drawing taped to the refrigerator, a hand-lettered "good morning" note with a crooked heart, a joke shared in bed that made both of them laugh for no particular reason. He realized he was not saving anyone as much as he was committing to the reciprocity of daily care, showing up in ways that mattered more than any one-time act. One afternoon, not long after Gustavo recovered, Marcelo sat on a narrow bench in the park, watching the boy run with a triumphant, reckless abandon. Children have a way of running toward life that is unapologetic. A pigeon dove close and Gustavo clapped and cheered, as if he'd found the world anew. Simone sat next to him, the afternoon sun catching the edges of her hair like a halo that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with love. Marcelo took a breath that carried words he had kept folded for a long time. This was not an announcement or a grand speech. It was a confession he had been practicing alone in the quiet of his apartment. "I didn't expect this," he said. "Not you, not him. I thought my life had settled into a shape I could manage without being vulnerable." She turned to him, attentive and cautious. "We all say, 'I didn't expect this' sometimes," she replied, half smiling. He let the sentence fall into the simple dirt of the bench between them. "I think I love you," he said at last. The words were small because that's how confessions usually are, furnished with a vulnerability that makes them fragile. Simone looked at him with a look that held both history and a quick inventory of present realities. "You don't have to be afraid of saying it," she said. "I know what fear looks like on you." Her tone was not indulgent, but honest, steady as the woman he had come to know. He told her about the diagnosis years before, how medical language had become a locked door, and how he had learned to put his tenderness away like a tool too sharp to use in polite company. He told her about Renata, about the slow erosion of hope that sometimes masqueraded as acceptance. He told her about nights when he had thought a life without children was a wall he had learned to live beside. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, he did not ask for an answer. He had practiced honesty and found himself both scared and liberated by it. Simone reached out and touched his hand, not as possessive move but as a measurement of mutuality. "I've thought about you a lot," she said. "You are a part of our lives in a way that is not accidental. But love isn't a decision you make in the air. It's made in the living." There was a pause in which the park seemed to listen. Then she stood, tugged Gustavo by the sleeve and said simply, "Come to dinner tonight. We'll see how the little chef is at making pasta." His acceptance of that invitation felt like a scene already committed to memory, small, honest, domestic. He went that evening with the modest trepidation of a man who had once measured his worth in appointments and achievements. The dinner was simple, pasta with a sauce that tasted of tomatoes and persistent affection, laughter that erupted for no other reason than shared crumbs and an inside joke about pigeons. They cleared dishes together. No one else was watching. It was the domestic privacy of people building the scaffolding of life. Time did its steady work. They married in a small ceremony months later. No extravagance, no public pageantry. Simone wore a simple dress she had saved for a handful of moments. Marcelo wore a suit that had already been softened by his daily life. Gustavo stood between them, clinging to the hem of his mother's dress, and the friends who mattered. Donna Noisa, from the lanchonette, a nurse who had tended Gustavo at his worst, a man who worked in Marcelo's office but who had seen the quiet changes, were present. The vows were not ornate theological proclamations, but promises practical and human, to care, to show up, to make room for mistakes, and to build a life on steady attention. After the vows, they moved into Marcelo's apartment. Some worried that the move would erase Simone's rhythms, but they were not naive. Rather than bulldoze her world, they negotiated space. Gustavo's drawings took residence on the refrigerator, the small couch adapted to a child's heights, and the tiny dinosaur, Gustavo's talisman, found a corner on a shelf. Marcelo had the house softened, not in ways that made it lose character, but in ways that made it hospitable. Shelves at child height, a kettle that sang more often, a slow accumulation of small objects that announced their life together. Parenthood, when it comes as a choice made in the middle of already complicated lives, has a particular texture. There is no flawless manual. There are late nights, arguments over homework, missteps. There are times when the old insecurities flare. Marcelo's fear of not being enough. Simone's periodic worry of falling back into patterns she had fought to escape. There are also satellite joys, The first day, Gustavo rode a bike without training wheels. The time he spelled a word wrongly and then triumphantly corrected himself. The way he learned to make Marcelo laugh with a private joke about pigeons that never stopped being funny. Years moved with the ordinary constancy of seasons. Professionally, Marcelo kept working but with a different rhythm. He took fewer trips and chose philanthropic projects that aligned with a new sense of purpose. He learned to be less transactional in his relationships, more present in small ways that counted. A soccer game attended, a homework assignment checked with patience, a scraped knee kissed with a seriousness that wiped pain from the world for a moment. Simone continued to work. She found new employment that allowed for greater stability and began to take classes in the evenings. Accounting, a skill she admired as a kind of personal independence. She never lost the tooth of practicality she'd been raised with. She taught Gustavo to put aside coins in a little box, and sometimes together they would count them and decide what small thing to buy, a comic, a baseball, a treat. And the ritual was as dignifying as any large present. There were also quiet moments when the weight of the past still pressed into evenings. On a rare hard night, when a whisper of fear, old and persistent, found its way into Marcelo's chest, he would call a friend and speak the truth without adornment. "I'm afraid," he'd say. "I don't want to lose this." The friend who had watched the changes would respond, "Being afraid means you care." It became a small mantra, a way to translate vulnerability into proof of feeling. As they settled into a family shape that felt homegrown rather than manufactured, a new possibility nudged at the edges of their life. Gustavo, who at 6 had once clung to the smallest dinosaur, now had a friend in school named Lucas, who lived in an orphanage on the other side of town. Gustavo came home one day with the kind of question only children ask without measuring consequences. "Can we have more kids?" When Simone explained that wasn't a small decision, Gustavo shrugged and said, "I mean kids who don't have moms like ours." The seed of adoption grew quietly, first as an idea, then a research project, then a gradual, patient course of applications and interviews. Marcelo and Simone talked late into evenings, balancing the practical realities with the emotional readiness that parenthood requires. They did home visits, sat with counselors, and answered questions that sometimes felt invasive, but were designed to protect the children who might come into their care. They took classes required by the adoption agency and met other families who carried similar hopes and terrors. When finally the day came, there was no dramatic announcement. A small boy, shy and curious, came into their lives. He arrived with a cardboard box of his belongings and eyes that measured the world carefully. Gustavo bounded in first, offering a tiny car as if it were the most precious gift, and the other boy accepted with a hesitant smile that broadened. They taught him how to make pasta, how to call Marcelo Dad, with the tentative pride of someone testing a new language. The family felt, in those first weeks, like a house being built quickly and solidly, walls erected by daily rituals. Years later, on a bright morning at the city park, where the jacaranda trees had matured into broad umbrellas of purple shade, the family sprawled on a blanket like a small, content continent. Marcelo watched the two boys chase each other, their laughter folding into the air. Simone leaned her head on his shoulder in that private way of long marriages. The adopted boy, now comfortable and boisterous, flung himself at Gustavo and then at Marcelo, trusting the boundaries of a life that had been newly secured. Neighbors could have told you how simple the change looked from the outside. A man who once walked alone now, a part of a family that moved as a single body. But from the inside, the story was more complicated and richer. It was the labor of choosing each day to show up, to tie a shoelace, to hear about school drama, to make soup because someone had a cold. It was the ongoing practice of presence that softened fear and widened joy. At the center of all this was that small sentence spoken in a supermarket months before. "I will pay you when I can." It had been the trigger, yes, but not the cause of everything. What it represented was deeper. A refusal to be diminished by circumstance, an insistence on integrity, and the dignity of a person who insisted on keeping her promises even when the stakes were small. That sentence reached beyond the register. It reverberated, opened a space where other promises could be made and kept. Promises of care, promises of presence, promises to stand by a child in the night. Marcelo never wanted his role to be seen as a rescue in the sense of elevation from misery to comfort. He understood, perhaps painfully well, the thin line between help and domination. He tried to be careful with his gestures, to make kindness practical and mutual. Simone had taught him how to accept without being diminished. By paying back in ways that mattered, taking responsibility for household chores, teaching Gustavo to be kind, balancing work with family life. They saved each other in ways that sometimes felt easy and sometimes felt like the slow, strenuous work of two people learning to be a family. There were quiet victories along the way. The night Gustavo earned a school prize for a drawing. The time Simone was promoted at work and called them both to celebrate. The afternoon, Marcelo built a small bookshelf and watched the boys argue over which shelf a dinosaur belonged to. There were also losses, not the heavy tragedies that erase joy, but the small pains of life that leave their marks. An argument said with too much sharpness, a fear of illness that returned for a time, the occasional feeling of not being enough. They navigated these like sailors learning to correct course, small adjustments that kept the vessel afloat. One evening, as the three of them sat by the window watching rain stitch silver lines across the city, Marcelo thought of the arc of his life and the way it had been quietly rerouted. He remembered the fluorescent light of the hospital, the beeping monitors, the small tense fingers of a mother clinging to the edge of despair. He thought of the supermarket and a coin counted like an offering. He felt grateful, yes, but his gratitude had a shape that was not one way. He had been given a life that required him to be more present than he had ever imagined. He had been curiously, wonderfully changed. In the quiet of that evening, he placed his hand over Simone's on the table. "Thank you," he said simply. She looked up at him, and in that look was an economy of everything they had been through. "We promised ourselves," she said. "You promised to be here in the small ways. I promised to keep my dignity. This is what we built." Years later, when people asked Marcelo about how he had changed, how he came to be the kind of man who would step out of his accustomed orbit, he would tell them, in the plain way he now spoke, that it began with a sentence so small it could have been ignored. He liked to repeat it, not as a relic but as instruction. "I will pay you when I can." The words were not a plea, but the kind of honesty that invites response. There is a lesson in the shape of small acts. They bend lives toward one another. They demand presence and steady attention, not spectacle. The millionaire in this story was not saved by the coins he spent, but by the humility of listening and the willingness to be engaged in ordinary care. Simone was not lifted out of her life by charity. She continued to work, to teach her son the rituals of independence, to choose mutuality over dependence. Gustavo, and the child they later adopted, learned what it meant to belong to a household where presence outlasted promises. I tell you this because we live in a time when the scale of problems can feel like it requires grand solutions. There is merit in big gestures, of course, but often the durable changes in a life come from the accumulation of quiet things. Meals shared, nights kept awake, phone calls returned, hands held at the right moment. A promise kept is also a habit of the heart. So when you find yourself listening to someone speak a small sentence in a crowded place, don't let it feel insignificant. If you hear, "I will pay you when I can," listen for the dignity underneath. Often the smallest pledges are made by the proudest hands, and honoring them can begin a friendship, change a family, heal an old loneliness. May kindness find you, and may you be given the courage to keep the promises you make. If this story touched you, share it with someone who could use a reminder that small acts truly matter. And if you want more stories that feed the heart, subscribe and come back. There are always more quiet, hopeful things to hear.